Welcome to the Manga Bay Newscast. It's March 9th, 2022, and I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today we look at mangrove restoration and the effectiveness of nature-based solutions to climate change more broadly. The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, released a new report last month, and its findings have been described as a dire warning about the consequences of inaction, as global warming is already having dangerous and widespread impacts on planet Earth and affecting the lives of billions of people around the world. But the IPCC report also says that nature has huge potential to be part of the solution, not only for reducing the impacts of climate change, but also for improving people's lives. Nature-based solutions like restoring forests and other critical ecosystems are key, according to the report, because healthy ecosystems are more resilient to climate change while sequestering more carbon and providing other services such as food and clean water. IPCC Working Group 2 co-chair Hans Otto Portner said in a statement accompanying the report that by restoring degraded ecosystems and effectively and equitably conserving 30 to 50% of Earth's land, freshwater, and ocean habitats, society can benefit from nature's capacity to absorb and store carbon, and we can accelerate progress towards sustainable development, though he noted that adequate financing and political support are still needed. The IPCC report also makes it clear that nature-based solutions are no silver bullet to climate change, and if not done right, they can actually have adverse impacts on our planet and human livelihoods. For instance, the report notes that while restoring forests in areas where forests previously existed can have numerous benefits, planting trees where they haven't grown naturally in the past can lead to increased carbon emissions, negative impacts on wildlife, and decreased food availability for local communities. To help us dig into all this, we speak today with Alfredo Quarto, co-founder and program and policy director of the Mangrove Action Project. He tells us about the ongoing destruction of mangrove forests around the world, why it's so important to restore these coastal ecosystems, and what makes for successful mangrove restoration projects. We also speak today with Norah Berk, a policy advisor on climate change and forests at the Rainforest Foundation UK. She tells us that one big problem with nature-based solutions is that in many cases they have been co-opted by corporations who are using them as part of carbon offset schemes. And she also discusses why land titling for Indigenous and local communities is the solution to climate change that we should be focusing on.
Nature-based solutions and carbon offsets are not a solution for climate change. They are likely going to delay real climate action, and there's a huge risk to the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. We're already seeing a global green rush beginning and land grabs happening over areas managed by Indigenous peoples and local communities. The real, most effective way to protect the world's biodiversity and reduce carbon emissions from land use change is to protect the rights of the communities who have been living and managing these areas.
We've discussed many different types of ecosystem restoration on this podcast, but mangrove restoration is something we have yet to take a close look at, which is why we wanted to hear from Alfredo Quarto today. The Mangrove Action Project has more than a dozen restoration projects in North and South America, Africa, and Asia. I asked him to explain what mangroves are and why they are so ecologically and socially important.
Mangroves are a type of coastal rainforest. Many people don't realize that they're actually a rainforest. They grow in the tropical and subtropic areas, and they're a halophyte, they call them, because they can grow in salty water conditions, in brackish water. Most plants cannot handle salt, so they will not be able to survive. But mangroves have filled a very important niche along the coastlines of many countries in the subtropics and tropics, including in Asia, Africa, Latin America, even North America. In the U.S., we have them in Florida and Texas and so on. So mangroves are very important because they're coastal barriers to wave action and storms. They also are really important for nurseries, for fish. They're a type of forest, though, that can basically survive in conditions that most plants cannot. And so they're a very old forest, they've been around for millions of years. And they probably started in the Southeast Asia area of Indonesia and Malaysia, Thailand area. And then through their ability to send off seedlings that can float on the ocean, we're able to travel vast distances to other islands, other continents, including to North America, even in Africa and so on, in South America, where they were able to colonize. And so we see mangroves around the world in these areas that have them, and unfortunately they're endangered now, and yet they're so vital for our planet and for the ecosystems that support the marine environment.
You mentioned that mangroves act as nurseries. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there are places where the small fish can actually hide from the bigger fish and survive to grow up to be big fish themselves. So they provide also nutrients in the waters that make food for the small fish. And so the leaves falling into the water and branches will decay, and the detritus that it forms is actually feeding these zooplankton and the phytoplankton that lives in those areas. So the small fish and other types of marine life can depend on that for their growth. And also the hiding places, like I mentioned, from the bigger fish. Otherwise, the small fish could be eaten. So it's a chance for some fish to grow up, and they were nurseries because of that. Also, they're good hiding places. They hold the soil intact. They clean the waters from inland debris or pollution. They protect the coral reef and the seagrasses also from turbid waters by holding down the sediments and silt. And they also protect them from the poisons, like from metal or other types of contamination that can be coming into the mangrove areas before it reaches the seagrass or the coral reef. So they're very important for that. And they basically are harboring a lot of the fish life and marine life that will use them as nurseries, like I mentioned. So a lot of the fishermen can fish near shore and get the fish they need. Without the mangroves, they often have to go very far offshore to fish. And oftentimes they don't have very many fish to catch when they're offshore. So mangroves do harbor a lot of sea life, which is really important for local communities.
On the subject of the benefits to humans, one important role of mangroves, which you also mentioned, is coastal protection. I know they help protect shorelines from storm surges, and when they're destroyed, that can lead to much more severe flooding and damage to coastal infrastructure. Can you tell us more about the ways we benefit from healthy mangroves and the impacts of mangrove destruction?
Yeah, let me just begin by saying when I first started with Mangrove Action Project, I found a lot of governments and other people would say that mangroves are a wasteland. They're basically a mosquito-infested swamp, not worth anything. So oftentimes mangroves were destroyed because they were looked at as just kind of in the way. So shrimp farming spread like crazy in the early 1990s and 2000s, and spread where about half the mangroves were basically destroyed by shrimp farms in those days. 2 to 3% loss of mangroves. It was after the tsunami of 2004, December 2004, that people started waking up to the fact that mangroves were an important living buffer to help mitigate the effect of waves and winds. And this is actually known beforehand, before the tsunami, because in both the Philippines and also India, there were huge, what they call super cyclones that hit these countries, and tens of thousands of people were killed. But where the mangroves actually stood their ground and had not been yet cleared for shrimp farms or other developments, populations living behind the mangroves were actually spared from the ravages of these storms. So it was already known that mangroves were important buffers, but it wasn't until the tsunami that it was actually taken more seriously by more governments and other government officials, scientists, and so on. So we started seeing a change in attitude towards the mangroves at that time. We were trying to publicize the importance of mangroves before that as important buffers, but we couldn't get anywhere until the tsunami. When the tsunami actually hit, I was able to get on the radio stations, around 30 over radio stations around the world, including Canada and US, talking about this, and I was able to really spread the word that mangroves were lost in those areas. The death toll and the damage to property was a lot greater where they were lost. So this was important to note that it was then people started paying attention to that important role that mangroves play. And then the value of mangroves at one time was considered to be about $700 per hectare, basically based on fishing and lumber values. Shrimp farms were looked at as $2,000 to $3,000 a hectare, where you could have a shrimp farm making much more profit. Well, the mangroves after the tsunami, the value of mangroves went up to $20,000 to $30,000 per hectare, just because of the role they play in buffering the coastline. This was really important to see those changes in attitude. The IUCN and other UN agencies started talking about mangroves as really important to preserve. And then governments started paying more attention to that as well when they started seeing the huge bills they had to pay for loss of property and so on, the lives that were lost. They started paying more attention to mangrove loss, and recovery was important at that time. Unfortunately, we saw the recovery was not happening in a way that was effective, and many of the results of restoration projects were basically failures, about 80% failure rate. That's why MAP got involved at that time in trying to do a restoration project that would bring back the mangroves more sustainably and long term.
What are the main drivers of mangrove destruction today? You've mentioned coastal development and shrimp farming. Are those still the predominant drivers?
I would say so. All through the 90s and 2000s, early 2000s, it was the main drive was shrimp farming. and that changed. But at one point, the loss was around 1 to 2% per year, up to 3%. Depending on what country you're talking about, though, in certain countries like Thailand, it could have been higher. Thailand's lost over half their mangroves have been lost. Indonesia as well have lost over half their mangroves, which is huge areas of loss, mainly due to shrimp farms. Also, coastal developments from tourism were causes. But nowadays, the loss rate might be around 0.3%, they think, because more countries are now getting behind conservation of their mangroves and restoration projects. But as I mentioned, the restoration projects are not successful oftentimes. What they call a restored mangrove is not actually restored. And also, there's new developments that are happening, coming into coastal areas from urban expansions and farming and so on, like palm oil is now a big factor. But the thing is, oftentimes the loss rate has decreased because all the mangroves in those countries that were the main drivers of loss have now been lost. So there's not much more mangroves to lose in those areas that were prominent in the early days of loss. Those countries now have very little mangrove left to take down. So we really need to try to talk about the restoration effort, because a lot of the degraded forests are now looked at as mangrove forests that are healthy when they're not healthy at all. There's big bare patches or dying mangroves or not very healthy mangroves in areas that are still being declared as mangrove areas. So we need to really look at what exists today and pinpoint where we can need to restore and improve the health of those mangrove forests.
What does mangrove restoration actually entail? What are the activities involved? And how does the Mangrove Action Project support that work?
Yeah, one of the issues that we worked with after the tsunami especially, we saw a lot of failures. Huge money was going into mangrove restoration. There were projects that were basically Guinness World Records, planting 1 million or 3 million propagals or seedlings in one day, with 300 or more villagers involved in planting. And these Guinness World Records sounded great on paper or talked about in news, but when you went there afterwards, most of those mangroves were dead afterwards, because they were planting them, for one, in salt flats or mud flats or even seagrass beds. So the mangrove restoration efforts were not really restoration. They were afforestation, plantation, and they weren't successful by and large. The ones that were successful were plantations only with one species. Countries like Indonesia or Thailand might have 30 or 40 species of mangroves, and you're planting only one. So you weren't really restoring the mangrove. You were restoring basically a plantation, which was not very healthy oftentimes. So we were working with Robin Lewis at that time, who was in Florida, and developed a method called the EMR, or Ecological Mangrove Restoration. We took his concept of restoring the mangroves, ecosystem-based approach using hydrology to restore mangroves. We created what we call the community-based ecological mangrove restoration, CBEMR. So CBEMR basically takes his approach, but brings it down to the community level, where you get the local communities involved in restoring and involved in knowing how to care for their mangroves, how to conserve and monitor the mangrove areas. This is very important. So we have a long-term solution based on local knowledge and local involvement. And working with the ecosystem approach, meaning we work with how mangroves actually restore themselves. For one thing, their hydrology has to be intact, or at least restored to a point where mangroves can again survive in a good way. One of the issues we work with is bringing back the fresh water flows of streams and rivers that might be blocked. Oftentimes you see a lot of mangrove restoration, so-called restoration projects, we call just basically gardening approach, which means planting by hand seedlings in the ground. But people do this, do not pay attention to where they're planting, what seedlings they're planting, and when they're planting. And oftentimes the areas they're trying to restore are unrestorable because of conditions locally. Conditions are not right locally. So these people are planting basically in areas that might have debris blocking the streams, stopping the water flows of fresh water, which mangroves need, because mangroves basically need a brackish water condition to survive. They can survive in pure fresh water, but they can't outcompete the freshwater plants. That's why you don't see them growing upland. The freshwater plants outcompete them. But in salty conditions, mangroves can thrive. But if there's not enough fresh water to feed those mangroves, they will not survive. So high salinity can kill mangroves. So if you have flooding conditions where you block a roadway, say blocks a stream or blocks the exit of the water for high tides, those mangroves can drown because they can't breathe at high tide, or low tide, I should say. And mangroves have root systems that are able to breathe through the roots. So when the high tide is there, they kind of hold their breath. They're what's called the lenticels, hold their breath. They kind of close up at low tide, they open up again so the mangroves can actually breathe and basically exchange oxygen and carbon and so on. So we need to look at the mangrove ecosystem as an integral part of the ecology of the coast and work with that on an ecosystem-based approach. Also, another fault with a lot of mangrove restoration efforts, or they, besides making plantations happen, don't really pay attention to what mangroves need as far as nutrients, the hydrology, the situation along the coast. We have to look at all those factors before we start trying to restore an area to see if it actually is restorable. And you have to know what caused the problem in the first place. Why are the mangroves not there now? What happened to those mangroves? Were they bulldozed? Were they hit by heavy waves? Pollution, for instance, contamination from pesticides came in. We have to find out what caused the mangrove loss in the first place and then try to repair the damage by stopping that further loss from the same problem. For me, it's like having a fishbowl where you have one of your fish die and you just put another fish in place. It's going to die too until you get the solution of why that fish died. So mangroves are similar in a sense. You need to find out what's causing their problem of loss and then remedy that before you start trying to restore. So our system of CBEMR, Community-Based Ecological Mangrove Restoration, actually works with nature as we try to get the seedlings to come back on their own. And normally mangroves will drop their seeds at the tides, and the tides bringing in the seeds will bring in the mangrove seedlings to different aspects of the beach, different locations on the coast. And those seedlings will plant themselves in kind of a zonation effect, where certain mangroves will grow at a higher altitude of shoreline. Other mangroves can grow down lower in the more lower tidal areas. So this is what we try to reproduce. And plus you have more of biodiversity. We're trying to imitate the natural biodiversity of the area by letting the mangrove seedlings plant themselves and also bring in the biodiversity of those different plants that can grow there. And like I mentioned before, most restoration projects that exist out there are now planting one variety, the red manglar, or the red mangrove, and it's a Rhizophora, it's called in the scientific name. And they don't plant the other varieties because they're not easy to grow. The red mangrove has a seedling which is it's called a propagule. It's like a long pea-shaped or pencil-shaped seedling. And they can stick the seedling in the ground, in the mud, and it'll grow, supposedly. But it's not really an effective way of doing it, and also we find not much biodiversity involved in that kind of approach.
So natural regeneration is the best mangrove restoration strategy, in other words.
Exactly. You want to find out, like I mentioned, there's different steps. We have like a 7 or 8 step process. The first step is to find out why the mangroves were not there in the first place. What happened to those mangroves? What was the cause of their loss? The second is to find out what we can do to try to remedy those problems that caused that loss. And it can be something simple like, goats or camels basically eating the mangrove seedlings. If you don't fence that off the area, it's not going to be restored. Or fishermen may be dragging their boats on shore and killing the mangrove seedlings to be basically stopping them from returning. So you have to figure out what's causing that loss. Is it a shrimp farm that might be the cause of clearing the large areas of mangroves to make the shrimp farm? Is it charcoal industry making charcoal out of the mangroves? So we have to find out what's the root cause and then deal with that. Is that going to happen again? Because if it happens again, your restoration effort is not going to succeed. It'll be a 1 year, 1 month down the line, the mangroves will not be there. So we try to figure out if that can be dealt with. And we try to find local seed sources that are nearby that can repopulate the area, recolonize the area. If that's not there, for instance, if all the mangroves have been destroyed around the area, we may have to bring seedlings in, and we can also plant them by hand, or one way is to cast them into the tides and have the high tide take them up on shore. So we have a way to bring back the seedlings that way. But in any case, we're hoping to work with nature as much as possible and restore a more biodiverse ecosystem. It's not going to be just a monoculture, as we see in many cases, in fact, most cases. And these cases of monoculture plantation are huge, costly, millions of dollars being spent. World Bank loans from hundreds of millions of dollars have been put into these failures. And yet, if you look at the actual evidence year after, 2 years later, you'll see a dismal failure rate, 75 to 80%, like I've mentioned, in countries like Philippines where they've tried these kinds of efforts. And yet the problem is the failures are not reported on because there's very little monitoring done after the fact. You don't see people going back to those Guinness World Records sites and looking at what actually is there afterwards. If they did, they'd probably come back saying we've only got 5% of the mangroves still growing that we planted. They don't talk about that. And so you have these government agencies and World Bank type of loans going to failed projects because they're not mentioned beyond a first month or so of planting. They can report, 90% success at that point, but if you go back in the time afterwards, you'll see a lot less success and a dismal failure to report.
Yeah, well, I guess no one is excited about reporting their failures to the world, but this is an issue I've encountered in my reporting on reforestation and other kinds of ecosystem restoration. Very little reporting or study is done on failed restoration projects, even though it could potentially be very valuable to know what doesn't work and what the mistakes are that lead to failure. But you mentioned afforestation, which is, of course, planting a forest in an area that wasn't previously a forest. Would you say that's one of the biggest causes of failure in mangrove restoration?
I think the big cause is that what you just said, because most of the mangroves are actually planted in mud flats. That's the biggest open area of land along the coast that people think, oh, this is a great place to put mangroves. They're easy to put in the mud. And mangroves are not grown in mud flats for a good reason. It's an ecosystem that exists as a mud flat because it's too far low in the sea level. So the waters are there a longer time. The wave action can be stronger. Mangroves can't really root there very easily. And also the mudflat serves its own purpose. It's a very important ecosystem for birds and so on to feed and migrate. And they serve their own function. So it's a vital ecosystem itself that you don't want to convert to a mangrove. And, we have a paper that talks about basically mangrove, mudflats, seagrass beds. They're all kind of interconnected. So you really want to keep the mangrove where it is and use that zone as a mangrove zone and not try to convert one thing to another. We've seen people planting in seagrass beds, which is pretty crazy. It's not a good place to plant. But yet they do this in the Philippines and other places. We've seen pictures of mangrove seedlings being planted in deep waters, in seagrass beds and so on. And the survival rate is dismal. There's no other way around it. So these kinds of mistakes are being made over and over again. And that's just something that we have tried to deal with by really urging agencies that are involved in restoration to do some kind of a checkup, kind of monitoring afterwards and assessments of their actual work, and then be able to report back to the others who are going to try this again so they'll avoid the same mistakes.
So mangrove restoration, like all ecological restoration, is considered a nature-based solution to climate change, right? Can you talk a little bit about mangrove restoration in the context of nature-based solutions?
I think nature-based solutions sounds good, and the term sounds like it's appropriate. But oftentimes we hear that term being used in a way that doesn't describe really a nature-based solution. And it's oftentimes like mitigation is looked at as a way to destroy an area here if you replant it over here. You move the seedlings to another place or the trees to another place. And it's not really working very well. The idea is the mitigation is not followed up on again with the long-term monitoring. For one thing, if you destroy a full, healthy forest and try to replant it elsewhere, it's going to take years for that replanted area to become a healthy forest again. And you've lost a lot of the integral parts of that healthy forest, the epiphytes and the animal life, the root systems, algae, fungus, whatever is there that grows in the healthy forest cannot be replicated so easily in the replanted or mitigated forest. And so, as well, there's not enough monitoring long-term to see if that replanted area is actually healthy and growing. And so the damage has already been done to a healthy forest, where 30 years from now, the replanted area might be a dismal failure. And so you've lost both the healthy forest and the mitigated areas is also not functioning properly. So nature-based solution, I have a hard time understanding it. I know there's some problems with it, I've heard. It's basically looking at restoring nature, but not including, I think, people in that process, like the local indigenous people. Are they involved in that nature-based solution? We think without involving local communities, whether indigenous peoples or native peoples or traditional people, in that solution, it's not going to work. We can't just move people out of the area. That's one of our concerns, is that when we talk about these programs, we make sure that the local populations are there and who live in that area are given the rights to manage their ecosystem and be able to sustain their lives as well as sustain the ecosystem itself. They have to be basically involved in the process, and it might include some training where they can be trained in how to monitor, how to conserve and restore, how to sustainably manage the resource. That's important. So this is, I want to see those kinds of elements built in a nature-based solution. It includes human nature in the process as well. That's important.
Well, the term nature-based solutions is usually meant to refer to solutions to climate change as well as other environmental crises we're facing. But is mangrove restoration a good way to help halt global warming?
Mangroves play a very vital role in climate change. They can accrue soil where they stand, so that keeps coastlines from being eroded by stronger wave action and rising sea levels. Also mitigate against increasing storms from hurricanes and so on. So it's really important to understand those values of mangroves. They also sequester up to 5 times or more carbon than most other forest species. Mangroves, seagrasses, and salt marshes are very important for carbon sequestration. So we really need to protect those coastal wetland areas. And we need to keep developments from happening in those areas, like shrimp farms, for instance, hotels and other kinds of developments are just ruining the mangrove areas. There's even golf courses being put in mangrove areas, filling in the mangroves to make golf courses. So we really need to look at what we're destroying and reverse those destructive tendencies and conserve the remaining mangrove. Restoration is really important as a backup, but the first step we really need to do is conserve what still exists and what's still healthy and try to regenerate a healthy mangrove area, healthy forest, and try to restore those areas that need restoration, but really conserve what exists so we're not losing that. And what people can do is also cut back on their use of shrimp that's imported. When they consume imported shrimp, most likely 90% of that's imported from countries that have shrimp ponds in mangrove areas. It's not helping the local people. It's not helping the local ecology. So we need to reduce our consumption of shrimp here in the U.S. and Europe and Canada and so on to try to increase the benefits of a healthy ecosystem. We cannot keep our consumption levels so high. Other products, like I mentioned, palm oil is a big factor nowadays too, just destroying rainforests and even getting to the mangroves now. So these kinds of consumption habits have to be really altered, and we need to put pressure on those who are producers of these kinds of products, producers of shrimp, palm oil, other types of products, to produce them in a more sustainable, healthy manner. These are things we can do. And I just want to mention Mangrove Action Project. We're at www.mangroveactionproject.org, our website. Please visit us and look at what we have there to offer and join the work we do. Please help support the work we do.
The science is clear on how we stop global warming, and there's no way to do it without drastically reducing emissions from our use of fossil fuels and other human activities like deforestation. Nature-based solutions can certainly play an important role, but there are many environmentalists who feel that their effectiveness has been overstated, or that they're a distraction from the real work that needs to be done to reduce emissions, especially by curtailing our use of fossil fuels. Norah Berk is here to discuss this viewpoint. I asked her to start by defining exactly what it is we're talking about when we talk about nature-based solutions.
It's a really good question because it seems like nature-based solutions can be anything and everything that has to do with interventions around sustainably managing natural resources. So I think when nature-based solutions first came on the scene, there were a lot of environmental organizations that were really excited because it felt like nature was finally getting the attention that it deserved. And to be clear, there's an urgent need to scale up investment in protecting biodiverse ecosystems and halting the destruction of our ecosystems. But as time has gone by, it seems like nature-based solutions, the term itself has been co-opted by wealthy companies and countries seeking to offset their carbon footprint rather than decarbonize their business models or economies. So, for example, I know the International Union for the Conservation of Nature has defined, actually I have the definition here. They defined nature-based solutions as actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So that sounds great, but because the definition is so broad, it allows for potentially harmful activities to count towards nature-based solutions as well. So for example, militarized conservation, or dubious offset projects that aren't actually linked to any reductions in carbon emissions from land, or tree plantations, or it's just too broad, and it doesn't specify that interventions that are actually really effective in protecting natural resources, namely land titling and securing the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities and other community-based adaptation strategies.
Can you tell us a bit more about the chief actions and policies that are considered to be nature-based solutions?
It seems more and more that nature-based solutions are mainly becoming an offset mechanism. So the theory is that if you either plant more trees, for example, which would be removals, carbon removals from the atmosphere, or decide not to cut down trees, which would be avoided carbon emissions from entering the atmosphere, then these are nature-based solutions and they can generate carbon credits, and these carbon credits can be sold to companies or countries that want to reach their net zero targets. That's what it seems like nature-based solutions is becoming. It's difficult because on the one hand, I want to fight against the term from being used interchangeably as an offset scheme, but more and more it seems like that's what nature-based solutions have become.
Can you give us an example of a project that illustrates these issues you're talking about?
Yeah, well, the Total project in Republic of Congo is a great example, which I know Mangabe has this article about.
Indeed, Mangabe has covered this project. We'll link to it in the show notes.
Basically, the oil giant Total is going to plant a 40,000 hectare tree plantation in the Bateke Plateau in Republic of Congo, which is naturally a savanna area. It's an ecosystem that there's been little scientific research done, so there's still so much to learn about the value of these savannas. They also underpin the livelihoods of hundreds of people and communities that depend on the savannas to support their food sources and livelihoods. And yeah, so their plan is to plant a bunch of trees, acacia trees that are non-native to Republic of Congo, harvest them after 20 years to then use for wood products. And meanwhile, they have a concession over the Cuvette Centrale peatlands in Republic of Congo. So the Cuvette Centrale peatlands, it's estimated they house 30 gigatons of carbon, extremely delicate ecosystem. They're not necessarily sequestering carbon as much as they're storing it and housing it. So on the one hand, they're able to exploit oil in this extremely delicate ecosystem where hundreds, if not thousands, of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous villages are located within and depend on them. They're able to exploit these areas while planting a industrial tree plantation that they're going to cut down after 20 years, and they're claiming this as their nature-based solution and counting the supposed carbon that's being sequestered by these trees towards their net zero commitment. One more example of when a carbon credit project has gone wrong. We helped set up a monitoring system with the local organization we work with in the Democratic Republic of Congo, whose name is APEM. And it's a monitoring system that's comprised of civil society observers placed throughout the country. And they monitored extensively the Maindambe RED program, which was the flagship RED program, jurisdictional RED program in the region.
RED, R-E-D-D, is the UN's program for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation.
And what they found is that the program hadn't obtained the free, prior, and informed consent of communities. Communities hadn't received the benefits they were promised. Their land rights haven't improved. But I just wanted to give this example because it shows so clearly how these top-down interventions don't work and how they can have unintended consequences on people and ecosystems. So the plan within the Pure Red program was to support communities to plant trees in the savanna areas. So communities, they figured, we don't understand why you want us to protect the savanna areas and plant trees, but hey, if you're going to pay us $5 per hectare, sure, we'll do it. So they started protecting the savanna areas and planting trees on them. And these savanna areas are traditionally used by women, where they collect mushrooms and snails and other food sources for their community. So after 2 years, they hadn't been cultivating these savanna areas. They'd been planting trees, and whole communities had felt the impact of food shortages from this loss of livelihoods, of female livelihoods. And meanwhile, they hadn't been receiving the payments they were promised for planting these trees. Now, at the same time, because they couldn't cultivate their savannas, the women had to recruit the men in the village to start cutting down intact forest so they could use forests instead to practice their livelihood, to get enough food to feed their community. And after 2 years of not receiving the promised payments, they burned all of the trees and the savannas that they were protecting in protest against the project. So in this way, I just think it's a great example how you see that these top-down interventions, when the land use plan is decided by somebody outside of the community and imposed on them, it doesn't fully reflect local needs. And this project ended up cutting off female livelihoods, putting more pressure on intact forests, and catalyzing bushfires that were far larger than the traditional small-scale localized fires that people usually undertake in the region. So yeah, that's just to give a counterexample to show that the best strategies are really when they come from the ground up, when it's the people whose livelihoods are affected, who live in those areas, when they decide what the best way is to manage those areas and say what their needs are, how this project can benefit them, and they're able to drive the vision of whatever intervention happens on their land.
Tell us in more detail, what is the problem with a company like Total saying they're going to grow these trees and offset the emissions from their oil operations?
Yeah, there are so many problems with these carbon offset schemes. First, there's the mitigation potential for carbon offset schemes and nature-based solutions, for example, is overstated. I think a lot of the energy and momentum behind nature-based solutions or offset was triggered by this paper by Bronson Griscom that was published in 2017, where they said nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions could account for 37% of global carbon mitigation. And, when you try to find other scientific papers, this is the only one. So the whole argument and scientific underpinning behind nature-based solutions depends on this one paper. So first of all, there's an overstated mitigation potential. Second, the carbon from burning fossil fuels is not interchangeable with the carbon that's sequestered by the biosphere. So when you burn fossil fuels, it remains in the atmosphere, 70% of it remains in the atmosphere for at least 100 years, and the remaining 30% remains in the atmosphere for over 1,000 years. So burning fossil fuels that come from reserves deep in the ground I think it should be considered as permanently remaining in the atmosphere. The time spans between carbon sequestered by ecosystems versus carbon released into the atmosphere by being burned, by burning fossil fuels is not interchangeable. So, right, as I said, when you burn fossil fuels, it remains in the atmosphere for hundreds to thousands of years. And carbon that's absorbed into ecosystems is transient and is shared between the different ecosystems and plants and can be released back into the atmosphere. So treating the Earth's ecosystems as if they're this enormous sink for carbon that's just not accurate, and ecosystems don't work that way. So I think when you burn fossil fuels, you should consider it permanently in the atmosphere. So those are two issues: overstated mitigation potential, and that the carbon from burning fossil fuels is not interchangeable with carbon absorbed by ecosystems. Another issue, which is what the Rainforest Foundation UK works on a lot, is the threats to Indigenous land rights. So we're already getting reports from the Congo Basin just weeks after Article 6, which is the article that finalize the rules and regulations for a global carbon market. Right after Article 6 was finalized at COP26 in Glasgow, we're already seeing this green rush for land in the global south. And we're getting reports of communities who have spent years trying to obtain community forest concessions, for example, signing over their land and carbon or resource rights within 10 or 15 minutes. So you're getting rogue companies rushing through different villages and communities, getting them to sign contracts that they don't have the time to really analyze together as a community or seek input from organizations that work closely with them. And they're essentially signing over their carbon or land or resource rights to a company that's then going to sell carbon credits in their name. So there's a huge risk that there's going to be this global land grab of communities in a rush to get land for generating carbon credits. And I don't know if you know Mordecai Ogata, but he's a Kenyan scholar, and he often says this when he talks about protected areas in relation to the 30% target that's under discussion for the post-2020 biodiversity framework. But he says, when we talk about protecting 30% of the world.
That's the 30 by 30 target a group of countries are expected to push for at the Convention on Biological Diversity later this year. More on that in a minute.
It's not going to be extending Hyde Park or Regent's Park or, even Central Park. It's going to be looking at land in the global south where their land tenure systems aren't recognized. There's not a lot of land titling. Land is cheap. There's not a lot of accountability or enforcement of different laws. So that's where most of the carbon credits are going to come from, likely, is going to be tropical countries and areas in the global south where there's such weak governance structures in place. Yeah, so there's a huge threat to the rights and livelihoods of Indigenous peoples and local communities through offsets, that they're going to be displaced. They're the people that have contributed the least to the climate crisis, some of the world's most vulnerable people, and yet they're going to bear the brunt of climate action. It's just, when you think about it this way, it's just a new form of green colonialism, in that Western wealthy countries that have been the most responsible for creating the climate crisis, instead of they themselves making the changes necessary to decarbonize, they're putting the onus and responsibility on Indigenous peoples to generate carbon credits for them.
I know the latest IPCC report that just came out warns about some of these kinds of unintended consequences of nature-based solutions. Have you read the report, and can you tell us what consequences it specifically highlights?
Yeah, well, I didn't have the chance to read all of the impacts that the report outlined, but from what I've read, it seems like it was mainly developed countries that were pushing for nature-based solutions to be included in this summary for policymakers. And meanwhile, it was developing countries that were pushing against nature-based solutions from being included. And the fact that there was an argument and reluctance from the IPCC to actually include this term within their summary, I think is a pretty telling sign that there's no scientific consensus on the potential for nature-based solutions to actually mitigate climate change. And, the footnote that they did include about nature-based solutions said that they're a subject of ongoing debate, and that they might lead to a misunderstanding that nature-based solutions on their own can be a global solution to climate change. So, yeah, I think that's a sign that we shouldn't be relying on nature-based solutions as our silver bullet to stopping climate change. But then in the same report, they do say that cooperation and inclusive decision-making with local communities and Indigenous peoples, as well as recognition of inherent rights of Indigenous peoples, is integral to successful forest adaptation in many areas. So I kind of feel like we're just digging our own grave by going down this rabbit hole of nature-based solutions, and meanwhile, the real initiatives that the scientific community has agreed on and that we know work are right in front of our eyes. And I wish there was more intention on land titling and working with Indigenous peoples and other local communities on sustainably managing nature.
So those are the sorts of things that you think are the better alternative to nature-based solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, who knows better how to manage carbon-rich ecosystems than the people who are living and have been managing them for hundreds of years, sometimes millennia. You know, these top-down interventions, when they're decided by somebody that's in a Western office that hasn't even lived in the country or knows nothing about the ecosystems, and they decide, oh, trees should be planted here, or oh, this area should be protected. How do they know better than the people who are residing in those areas, whose land that is?
And that's why you mentioned land titling for Indigenous and local communities as an important solution as well.
Yeah, exactly. Because it doesn't just ensure that Indigenous peoples and local communities can continue practicing their traditional land use systems, but it also prevents that land from being allocated to industrial exploitation, which is the real driver of deforestation and biodiversity loss. It's the overexploitation of our natural resources.
We are, of course, living in a pretty crucial time where we have to get serious about our response to climate change to avoid its worst impacts. You mentioned the post-2020 biodiversity framework, which will be decided at the Convention on Biological Diversity later this year. And I'd like to talk about that more, but first, how did nature-based solutions factor into the climate talks in Glasgow last year at COP26?
I think there were two sort of strands of positions on nature-based solutions. The first were the proponents of nature-based solutions, so how we spoke about the private companies that want to offset through purchasing offsets generated by nature-based solutions. Another are the big environmental organizations that have been instrumental in creating demand for nature-based solutions and saying, that they can be done, that it's possible to create high-integrity carbon credits and, putting all their weight behind nature-based solutions as a way to get funding for it. And then there was the grouping of organizations that I think I was a lot more exposed to, which are more reluctant to endorse nature-based solutions because we've seen what's happened in the past with RED programs and other carbon offset projects and just top-down interventions in general, how they don't tend to be effective in really protecting nature or the rights of people that are residing in biodiverse landscapes. So I think, fortunately, the latter group won and nature-based solutions wasn't included in the Paris Agreement. But now there's an effort to include nature-based solutions in the post-2020 biodiversity framework. And again, I think there's been a lot of conflict over that, and it doesn't seem to be in it at the moment, but we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens in the end.
RED Plus has come up a few times in our conversation here. How does that fit into all this discourse around nature-based solutions?
I mean, I wasn't around, I wasn't so active in this arena when RED Plus first came onto the scene, which was about 15 years ago now. But from what I've heard, it seems like it's very similar to nature-based solutions. That a lot of people were excited that finally it seemed like there was going to be a lot of funding that would flow to protecting forests and protecting the rights of communities. And after some time, it became clear that really the motive was to allow for countries and companies to avoid decarbonizing. Really, the aim was to produce carbon offsets. And I think that it seems like a lot of people are a bit tired of RED now. And after 15 years, it's sort of proven itself to be pretty ineffective in many regions of the world. For the reasons that I gave, that it's a top-down intervention. And by the way, the story that I told about the peer RED program in Mindumbe, we're getting reports that it's happening in other peer REDs in the region. So it's not an isolated case, but it seems to be systematic of all these top-down interventions that are imposed on people. So in many ways, it feels like people were almost tired of RED, and they came up with this new term, nature-based solutions, to almost replace RED, but it's essentially the same thing. I mean, the Bronson Griscom paper that sort of set out the the climate mitigation potential of natural climate solutions, over 2/3 of the mitigation potential comes from forests. And in the IPCC report, when they put a footnote in about nature-based solutions, the footnote comes after forest management or managed forests. So I think they're one and the same. It's, increasingly difficult to really tell the difference between nature-based solutions and REDD, besides the fact that REDD actually has more safeguards. And there are specific entities that are responsible for implementing REDD that you can sort of hold to account. But with nature-based solutions, it just feels like a free-for-all. Anybody can do a nature-based solutions. Total, an oil giant can do a nature-based solutions project. It's like there's less oversight.
What about ecological restoration? We've just discussed mangrove restoration earlier on this episode of the podcast, and restoring mangroves has a lot of benefits. But then you also mentioned that Total is planting trees in a way that's more plantation forestry than reforestation. But I'm curious what your take is on ecological restoration as a nature-based solution.
Yeah, I don't know enough about mangrove restoration, but from the scientific articles I read, it seems like natural regeneration of ecosystems is the best way to restore formerly degraded land. So by allowing, for example, in tropical forests, allowing tropical forests to naturally regenerate areas that were cleared. That's my understanding of it. I mean, you sort of think that if there must be some way that we can help the forest along to regenerate. But yeah, the scientific articles I've read seem to think that the best way is natural regeneration. And of course, preserving the forests that we do have, the old growth forests that are so rich in housing carbon, and not letting those areas be cut down. Yeah, I mean, there's so many articles and so much evidence that shows industrial tree plantations are really dangerous for ecosystems. They increase runoff, they can release carbon, they can bring in invasive species, they can displace local people, and in the end, they don't actually sequester more carbon or help biodiversity at all. So I think if guidelines for restoration don't have safeguards to prevent industrial monoculture plantations and the displacement of local people, then definitely there's a huge risk. And I think that's the problem in general with all of these terms, is that they can be manipulated so easily. Yeah, and in regions like the Congo Basin, as you guys wrote about, it's just a black box. So it's so easy for the different project developers to have a monopoly over the narrative and to claim that there's been so much progress and success, and the only thing that people have access to are what they publish on their website, because there's not enough monitoring systems on the ground to actually go look at what the environmental impacts are and, survey communities residing in the area.
Well, as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, it is, of course, hugely important that we protect and restore Earth's ecosystems, not just to address climate change, but to address a whole host of environmental problems we're facing, like biodiversity loss and water scarcity. So are there any so-called nature-based solutions that haven't been co-opted and actually are viable solutions?
Yeah, I think a lot of the initiatives around land titling and equipping communities with the means to monitor their land are really effective. I mean, for example, I'm most familiar with the context in the Congo Basin, and we have a program there to secure community forests for Indigenous peoples and local communities. And by far, the largest area of land that they decide, when they're making their land use plans and they decide what area of land they're going to dedicate to what, the largest area is always reserved for conservation. And they have so many stories and oral histories on why this area should be protected, and maybe even if they'll make up a story if they think it's important to start protecting it. So I think it's really about putting the people who have lived and managed these ecosystems for generations now putting them in the driver's seat and making sure that they have ownership over the project, that they're participating and deciding on the strategy and the activities that are going to take place on their land, and giving them the tools to monitor those areas. So when there are illegal logging actors, or when there's illegal logging or expansion of industrial agriculture companies that come through, that they can send alerts to the government and try to get them to crack down. And that's the thing. In these regions, there's often really fragile governance systems. So it's easy for private carbon credit project developers to come through and exploit these corrupt systems and get them to work in their favor so they can sell carbon credits without anybody knowing what's the truth on the ground. But when you invest in land titling programs and in supporting communities to enforce their legal rights, or cut down on illegal exploitation of their natural resources, this has trickle-up effects to improving governance in the region. And that's ultimately what really is going to work, by having robust, strong institutions that are able to crack down on illegal activities and industrial exploitation of natural resources, and supporting the rights of local people. So I think those are the solutions.
If you enjoy the Mangrove Newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep the show growing. Another way to help is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mangrove. We are a non-profit news outlet, so just $1 or more per month would really help offset production costs and hosting fees. If you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Front Line, please head to patreon.com/Mangrove to learn more and support the Mangrove Newscast. That's patreon.com/Mangrove. You and your friend can join the listeners who've downloaded the Mangrove Newscast more than 250,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mangrove Newscast app to gain fingertip access to all of our new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mangrove.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/Mangrove or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @Mangrove on both those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Mangrove Newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.